Senators held a weekend session as the government shutdown stretched into its 40th day today, but there were little signs of any progress. Senate Majority Leader John Thune says we're only a handful of votes away from reopening the government. Democratic leaders are pushing for an extension of subsidies under the Affordable Care Act as a condition to end the shutdown. President Trump said on Truth Social that Obamacare is the worst health care for the highest price. He also urged Republicans to redirect federal money that currently goes to health insurance companies under the Affordable Care Act and send it directly to individuals. Regarding tariffs, he also posted on Truth Social that people that are against tariffs are fools, adding that a dividend of at least $2,000 a person could be paid to Americans. A late-night decision on Friday from the Supreme Court on food stamps. It allowed the federal government to put a pause on fully funding SNAP in November. The court's decision pauses a lower court's order that forced the Trump administration to fully fund the food stamps program for November. The Trump administration had already committed to partially funding SNAP. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson issued the pause to give an appeals court more time to make a judgment on this government's appeal. She is assigned to handle emergency appeals from the First Circuit Court. The Supreme Court has not weighed in on the merits of the case. More than 2,500 flights were canceled this weekend as the FAA cut air traffic. This left travelers across the U.S. facing widespread disruptions amid the ongoing government shutdown. Officials warn the situation could worsen into the Thanksgiving holidays if the shutdown continues. According to FlightAware, the cancellations escalated yesterday with more than 1,500 flights called off following more than 1,000 the previous day. Major airports in Atlanta, Chicago, Charlotte, and Newark were among those seeing the heaviest disruptions. Staffing shortages at radar centers and control towers are worsening the situation. Many air traffic controllers who have gone without paychecks for nearly a month are working mandatory overtime 6 days a week, according to the National Air Traffic Controllers Association. Some have even taken second jobs to make ends meet. U.S. Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy warned that if the shutdown continues, even more flight reductions could be necessary. Experts say the impact isn't limited to passengers. Higher shipping costs and disruptions to tourism, manufacturing, and local economies could ripple across the country. Next, nationwide flight cancellations continuing for the third day amid the longest government shutdown in U.S. history. More than 1,700 flights were canceled today, according to flight tracking website FlightAware. The FAA announced initial cuts Friday as traffic control staff shortages continue. Here to discuss all things air travel amid the shutdown is travel blogger Jen Ruiz. Thank you so much for joining us, Jen. What is the state of the travel industry under the shutdown and with these flight cuts now?
It is really challenging, particularly air travel. You still have the alternative of taking a train, of driving somewhere if you're traveling domestically or somewhere that can be reached that way. But air travel is really chaotic right now just because we're at about 5% flight cancellations today, and we're expected to hit 10% by Friday.
Yeah, and we're talking about this 10%. So what impact could that have with that escalation?
A lot. So first, we have a lot of delayed and canceled flights, and that has a domino effect, particularly as the day goes on. So right now, the very first thing that airlines are encouraging people to do is to check to see if they're able to cancel their own flights or reschedule their own flights preemptively. Practically every airline has instituted a flexible cancellation program or policy so that you wouldn't get charged in order to make those changes. And it's uncertain whether or not this will be resolved by Thanksgiving. Kayak.com put out a study that Monday is actually the best day to travel, but I would absolutely advise trying to avoid air travel on those days on or around Thanksgiving wherever possible.
Yeah, and hopefully this won't even be an issue around Thanksgiving. We are hearing inklings of talk on Capitol Hill about the potential of this shutdown ending soon, but it is, a historically long shutdown. So, how can air travelers prepare for this year's holiday season if indeed, these cancellations and delays spread and perhaps go even beyond 10%?
Absolutely. So you mentioned FlightAware, which is a great site because it in addition to showing you where your actual plane is, you can actually search to see the number of cancellations per airport. It is the kind of major airports being affected now as opposed to the smaller regional airports. And definitely still traveling first thing in the morning is your best bet because the plane is usually already there and is not delayed coming from someplace else. Something new that we're seeing people do now is actually schedule what they call backup flights. So there may be scheduling 2 or 3 flights, hoping that one of them takes off. If you're able to make this work with the new flexible cancellation policies that are temporarily in place, absolutely take advantage of that. Otherwise, you can use points and miles as a way to book perhaps an alternate backup flight that you can cancel without penalties and just get those points reinstated to your account for any reason. So it is definitely a challenging time right now, but if you anticipate these delays, I would also recommend making sure that you have your information up to date on your app for the airline that you're flying with, because that's how you'll be the first to know when there is a cancellation or that there is something wrong so that you can hurry to rebook because time is of the essence. You're going to be trying to rebook with everyone else on your plane that is trying to do the same. And there's only going to be a limited amount of open spots on any alternative flights that are still going. So making sure your information is up to date and that you act quickly the minute that you get a notification is going to be of the essence.
Now, you mentioned, I want to go back, you mentioned how it's possible to, say, book multiple flights because of these flexible cancellation policies. So my concern with that, though, is that what if people, a few maybe unscrupulous people book 5 flights, 6 flights, just in case to have a backup for the backup. And then, the people who are trying to get places, they can't get a flight because of that.
And that is truly the unprecedented, pardon me, that is the unprecedented issue that we are dealing with right now, particularly because this hasn't really happened before. And so you are seeing that, and that is a possible consequence. And so I can't really speak as to whether or
Sure.
not that's going to be taking up spots for other people. It is going to be a natural consequence of kind of the chaos that we're in right now.
Yeah, but I guess, you got to do what you got to do. Do you have any tips for staying comfortable in an airport if you're waiting for a connecting flight? I mean, I had to spend the night in an airport earlier this year. It was not comfortable.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And so I would recommend Priority Pass. You can get one for as low as $99 a year, and it gives you lounge access to different lounges around the world. So even if you don't have a credit card or other airline status or way to access these lounges, you as a normal traveler or passenger can get access and have more of a place to relax, especially if you have long delays. I love the Minute Suites. They're under the Priority Pass program, and they're basically these rooms that you can rent out where you have a place where you can lay down, you have a television, you have snacks, and most importantly, you're away from the chaos of the airport. Also, for anybody who is autistic or just feels very overwhelmed by being around a lot of people at the airport. A lot of airports are now having sensory rooms, sensory deprivation rooms, where you can go in and have a quiet space. They're usually gated, so you have to enter a code, and not everybody can have access to them. And that's a great way for people who are feeling very overwhelmed by the stress of the airport to utilize those amenities provided.
That sounds like a nice place that we could have here at NTD because things get a little stressful sometimes, as you might imagine. How have you been personally affected by this? I mean, I imagine you have some trips planned. What are you doing?
I personally am looking wherever possible to see what the alternatives are, and if I can keep my travel domestic and if I can drive or take a train instead, which is sad. I actually travel quite often for my birthday, which is during the holidays. But we're, even if things are restored relatively quickly, like we're hoping they would be, we don't know what the effects will be long term on the industry. And so I'm not really 100% sure that the industry and that the air travel in general is going to reboot boot by the holidays and by New Year. So I'm trying to find alternatives wherever possible and plan trips that maybe are not as far or as I would have wanted to go, but that are still exciting here locally.
Well, let's hope this shutdown ends and everyone can get their holiday travel in somewhat of a reasonable shape because it's crazy enough as it is. Travel blogger Jen Ruiz, thank you so much. Joining me now to discuss the US-Hungary energy deal is Rod Martin, founder and CEO of Martin Capital, and Kervin Oakman, a former intelligence professional with direct experience in US-Russia relations. During the first Trump administration, he participated in an overt anti-Russia campaign and now hosts the geopolitical intelligence podcast, This Week Explained. Gentlemen, welcome back to the show. Kervin, the U.S. says its waiver for Hungary will last 1 year, but Budapest says it's indefinite. Help us make sense of this.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me on. Very important discussion and for the people of Hungary, I would say. So far, right now, if you trust the reporting and the analysis that I trust is that this is for 1 year with a supplemental flow for the future. So as of right now, we're looking at a 1 year reprieve from sanctions. It's very important because Orban is going through an election season, right? So we've got April elections coming up in Hungary, and this is something that was very important to the Hungarian people and that Orban needed to get from the Trump administration. And really, it's going to save the Hungarian people a ton of money, but it's also going to protect them through this winter season as well.
And staying with that, Rod, how important is Russian oil and gas to the landlocked nation of Hungary?
Well, you just hit it on the head. They're a landlocked country in the middle. They really don't have any good options for the time being. We can't just go in and build an LNG terminal in a place that doesn't have ocean access. Now, could we build one in Croatia and pipe LNG up to Hungary? Yes, and there is an existing pipeline through there that is useful as a supplemental source of supply, but certainly not to cover all the needs of the country. So Hungary really needs this in the same way that Slovakia needs this, perhaps a bit more. And so this is the right thing to do to help keep them on side, help keep them in the right direction. And you'll notice the rest of the deal is that the president got them to commit to some pretty significant purchases from the United States, including a bunch of small modular reactors. That puts money and jobs in the United States. It also lessens Hungary's dependency.
Kervin, what signal does this deal send to neighboring Russia and Ukraine and the rest of Europe, for that matter?
Well, I think what the rest of Europe is saying is that this is a bad deal. But look, the rest of Europe has been doing this as well. They've been bypassing sanctions in a few ways, purchasing Russian oil. Other nations are doing this. Look, this is a diplomatic win for President Trump, and I think a lot of people, especially some within other media sources, do not like when Trump gets a victory here. The Hungarian people needed this. My partner on the other side there was astute in his analysis of this situation. But what does this mean for Ukraine specifically? I don't see that this means much for Ukraine. Ukraine is still getting support from the United States. Trump is still putting pressure on Russia. This is a moment to protect the Hungarian people. And what does this signal to Russia? It is that if you come to a deal with U.S. President Trump and it is a deal in good faith, you are going to get support. And so this might be a trigger to Russian President Vladimir Putin that come to the negotiating table, signals a signing of a deal for a ceasefire, and maybe you can get some sanctions relief.
And at the same time, Russia does indeed benefit from this. They have another buyer of oil that they might not have otherwise. So, Rod, Hungary is one of Europe's largest buyers of Russian oil. What relief do you think this waiver will give to the Russian economy? How significant is this?
Not that significant. If we are able to dislodge India and at least in part China, and I'd guess that China's a lot tougher nut to crack on that than India, the Russian economy is just getting trashed. And that's on two sides. First, you have very, very limited purchases of Russian energy now, and that's only going to shrink. Second, they're selling it at about $35 a barrel, which is about half global market price. And it's certainly a lot less than they need to run the Russian government. The government is highly dependent on these oil and gas sales much more so than the Russian economy as a whole. So this is a drop in the bucket for Russia, but it's essential for Hungary. And especially, as I said, moving them more toward nuclear lessens their dependency on Russia or anybody else outside going forward. And that's going to matter too.
So we're talking about the economic impacts of this move on Russia, but what does it mean, Kervin, politically and militarily?
Yeah, I said
politically and militarily.
Sorry, Kervin.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No worries. I'd start politically. Politically, like I said, this means that if you come to the negotiating table with President Trump in good faith, there are going to be deals that are going to be struck. Militarily, look, Russia is in a military economy. The purchasing of gas at 35%, $35 or 35 cents on the dollar, that's not going to do anything. The reason Vladimir Putin will not come to the negotiating table and will not accept a ceasefire is twofold. One, he wants all of Ukraine, and two, or at least every part of Ukraine that Russia has now controlled militarily. And the second part is because this is a wartime economy. In a wartime, as soon as the war ends, the economy will collapse. Russia will be forced to pay certain aspects of this to rebuilding Ukraine, whether they win or not. That is going to collapse the Russian government. This is a war of attrition. Putin thinks he can win a war of attrition, and that is what he's going to try to do.
Ron, how are these oil sanctions playing out, not just for Russia like we discussed, but for the rest of the world?
Well, the European Union has spoken with forked tongue on this for years. They're finally getting their act together. And there are a few stragglers like Hungary, like Slovakia, that actually have to have their own special carve out. But in general, what is true is that the European Union has sent twice as much money to Moscow in energy purchases since the beginning of the war as they've sent to Kiev in aid, which is just absurd. That is finally ending. So that's actually a really big deal. The other thing that's a really big deal that must not be missed is that Ukraine is very self-consciously targeting Russian oil production. They had taken 17% of Russian refinery capacity offline as of the beginning of October. They're continuing those strikes. That could reach as much as 35% in reasonably rapid order. That actually puts the Russian economy in a situation where it can't supply domestic need. It certainly can't sell enough to keep the war machine going. So Russia really needs, they haven't decided to do it yet, but they ultimately need a deal with the United States that involves a lot of Western investment back into Russia. They're going to have to pay for that.
And so, we're talking about the impacts on Russia. Kervin, during this meeting with President Trump on Friday at the cabinet, Viktor Orban said that essentially it's almost inevitable for victory for Ukrainian victory, or at least for peace between these two parties, Ukraine and Russia. But it depends on whether or not the West can unify. And he stated that the rest of Europe has a sort of different approach to how to end this war. They think that he said they think that Ukraine should be able to push Russia back and win militarily. And he said basically it's possible, but so are miracles. So, what do you make of his statements? Do you think that the West is so ununified on this?
Yeah, I think some parts of the West are a little ununified now. I think, look, we want an end to this war. We, meaning the globe, right? I'm not talking about the global West or the global South. We all want an end to this war. And so who's going to agree to what? What does a Ukrainian victory look like? I think, early on in the discussions of this conflict, a Ukrainian defeat entirely was seen as possible. There were assessments that was likely, if not highly likely, that Ukraine would lose all of its sovereignty. We're not seeing that right now. Can Ukraine, to its people, send back a message that says, look, I know we lost eastern parts of our borders, but we won this war. We took on the big bear that is the Russian Federation and the Russian military. And Without the complete support of Western nations, we really did win this war. That's the miracle here. Does Ukraine have to push back Russia? I don't think so. I think we can come to a deal here, unfortunately, having to give up eastern parts. That's funny for me to say as someone who's not in Ukraine and who's not a Ukrainian, but I do think that's just the reality on the ground right now.
Rod, final thoughts?
Look, a Ukrainian breakout is possible. Maybe they can take back some territory. Maybe they can take back all of it. But I agree that that's in the miracle category. But at the same time, Russia has lost this war. Russia was seeking regime change in Kiev, which they were going to bring about by quickly capturing the country. That fell apart on them in the first couple weeks. So ultimately, you've got to get to some kind of negotiated settlement. Putin's problem is that he promised his oligarchs things that he cannot deliver, and he is personally endangered if he makes peace and makes that a permanent, concrete fact. So he's going to fight as long as he thinks he can get away with it. But the truth is, Russia's position is weakening every single day, and it's not just on the battleground.
All right, Rod Martin and Kervin Oakwin, thank you both so much for joining us. A speeding car evading the police crashed into a crowded bar early Saturday. 4 people were killed and 11 injured in a district in Tampa, Florida, known for its nightlife and tourism. In a statement, the Tampa Police Department said an air patrol unit spotted the silver sedan driving recklessly on a freeway at about 12:40 a.m. That's after it was seen street racing in another neighborhood. Highway patrol officers disengaged as the vehicle sped toward historic Ybor City near downtown. The driver lost control and hit more than a dozen people outside the bar, Bradley's on 7th. 3 people died at the scene and a 4th died at a hospital as of Saturday afternoon. 2 people were hospitalized in critical condition. 7 were listed as stable and 2 had been treated and discharged, police said. On Saturday, authorities announced that federal and state health officials are investigating 13 cases of infant botulism in 10 states. This is linked to baby formula that was being recalled. By Heart, Inc. agreed to begin recalling 2 lots of the company's whole nutrition infant formula. All 13 infants were hospitalized after consuming the formula from 2 lots. The cases occurred in Arizona, California, Illinois, Minnesota, New Jersey, Oregon, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Texas, and Washington. No deaths were reported. The FDA said it was investigating how the contamination happened and whether it affected any other products. Available online and through major retailers, the product accounted for an estimated 1% of national formula sales, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Democratic Socialist Zoran Mamdani has won the New York City mayoral race. What does his policy mean for the future of the city? NTD's Don Ma tapped Joshua Phillip, senior investigator, reporter for the Epoch Times, and host of Crossroads on Epoch TV for insight.
So let's talk about socialism, democratic socialism specifically. In your view, how do you feel about whether this has become more popular, more mainstream, or more widely accepted?
Well, the Democrats right now are kind of in a difficult position. The Democratic Socialists of America is technically a third party, but they really tried to integrate themselves into the main line of the Democratic Party because they can't win elections. So what they've done over the years, they've infiltrated the Democratic Party, they run under the Democrat ticket, they put their candidates as Democrats, and the Democrats, they haven't really wanted to split their party on behalf of them. The DSA, Democratic Socialist of America elements, though, they represent the more extreme kind of progressive, some might call it, parts of the party. The things representing more outright socialism. The things representing, gender politics, race politics, these are DSA issues. Whereas the old school Democrats used to be more like the big tent. If you go back to, 90s, 2000s, look where the Democrats were, like Trump used to be a Democrat. RFK Jr., maybe he's still a Democrat. Guys like Joe Rogan used to be Democrats. And so you do have kind of this big tent, 80% in the middle, that represents what the Democratic Party used to be. And some argue that the extreme positions of the DSA, they might work in local elections, but it might be a real gamble for Democrats to run with.
Okay, so how would you classify Zoran Mamdani's policies?
Zoran Mondani is going for more, I think, legit socialism. But the reality is he can only do it so much under the existing system. If you want to have real socialism, like pure socialism, you need to dominate everything, which is one of the reasons why socialists often say, well, it wasn't real socialism or it wasn't real communism. Just doing it in New York City, he won't have the ability to fully implement pure socialism. And he's walked back a lot of his statements. He said, for example, that he's not for like defunding the police. People pull up old posts from him. He very often talked about defunding the police. There are some mixed reports over his, government-run, again, I don't call them food halls or grocery stores. A lot of media have actually falsely quoted him saying he wants to give free food. Maybe that's part of it because, you could say food stamps are part of that. But what he's talking about are government-run grocery stores that would offer lower prices. The reality is when you do this, it's never sustainable because it messes up the entire free market. What you're likely to have is the lack of the insight into the free market from supply and demand. And you run into the same problems you have in every socialist country, which is the things in demand fly off the shelves, people buy it, people resell it. If he makes it too low of a cost, what's going to happen? You're going to have people, if, for example, it's more expensive in New Jersey, driving into New York, buying it in New York, and reselling it in New Jersey. It's going to upset the entire free market, and you're going to end up with shortages.
So can you give us some examples, real-world examples, where his policies are similar to his policies that have been implemented elsewhere, and what has happened?
Yeah. So in the United States, there actually have been experiments with, you call them like government-run grocery stores, or sometimes usually they're run by like nonprofits. And what results in it is basically poorly run they close down very quickly, typically. You end up with large amounts of theft, especially if they say they're not going to prosecute or go after crime. People just steal it because why not? You can look at California, where they're experimenting with light on crime policies as it related to like storefronts. And what happened? Right? Anything under like $900 is a misdemeanor. What happens? People go in and they steal everything they want because there's no punishment for it. You end up with resellers. This is one of the issues, for example, that New York has dealt with like cigarette taxes. It creates a massive black market where people just buy it in one place and sell it in another because you have the free market functioning outside the system. The other thing you have, of course, is just badly run systems where, the issue you have with government-run systems as opposed to privately run, if you want to have something work in the private market, you have to have a few things. You have to have it so that it's sustainable, people want to buy from it. You need to have good service so people want to go there and don't go to your competitors. When you make it government-run, you remove all of the information that educates what is demanded by the free market, quality of service and price.
I mean, what are the core fundamental principles of socialism? Is it just free stuff for those of us that is not so well versed in the subject?
There are different degrees of socialism. So, on the lighter end of it, there's like state capitalism. Technically, the Nazis, the National Socialist Party, the Nazis in Germany, they were technically like lighter socialism, which was a mixed model economy. They still had some free market principles, but a lot of socialist policies. And the way the Nazis worked is actually closer to the type of socialism light you see a lot of people trying to put in place in the United States. And what was it? Under the Nazis, of course, you had the mixed model economies, what they call state interventionism. And so you'd have, for example, businesses where the government would assign people to run the businesses, and you'd have a partially private, partially public system. That is light socialism. And so actually, again, I'm not talking about the race policies of the Nazis, but the economic policies. A lot of these socialists in America, in terms of economic policy, are closer to the Nazi party. But if you go to like real heavy socialism, that's when you get closer to actual communism. And so heavier socialism is when you get to like Stalinist type policies, breadline type policies. And if you get to that end of it, what is really socialism? Socialism is when you put communism into government. Communism is technically the negation of systems. It is not technically a government program, but you can implement communist policies within it. There are different extents of it. More extreme policies will have things like for like social divisions. More extreme policies will have things on, again, gender policies, agitation policies, where you try to view one person as your enemy, one person as your ally. We have seen this in the United States with gender policies and race policies. Every communist country has some kind of narrative with that, whether it's the evil billionaires or the evil kulaks, like they had, of course, of the wealthy peasants in Soviet Russia, whether it's the Jews like the Nazis had, who are deemed the enemies, whether it's the educated class, for example, in Cambodia, whether it's even in the United States where they called, the cis white male the enemy of the people, or whether now they talk about the evil billionaires as being the enemies of, the markets.
So how do you know when socialism has changed into communism? How do you know when communism is here?
Well, so this is where a lot of people get confused between socialism and communism. Socialism is the form communism takes when implemented into government. But true communism is only achieved with the negation of systems. So in order to achieve, quote unquote, real communism, the socialist state would need to basically implode. You would need to basically destroy all the existing institutions to, quote unquote, achieve communism. And so communism is not designed to work. It's designed to destroy. When a government becomes communist, they become a socialist government. You could say they're educated or inspired by a communist type, ideology or principle, but it will always be socialism when put into practice. So, and again, there are different degrees of it. I'm not saying Mondami is going to make New York City full-on communist. He's only going to be able to do it to a certain extent.
So you gave examples earlier of how socialism leads to problems, right? And history has shown that over and over. So why do we keep trying it?
Well, you'd think people would learn by now.
That's my question.
I would say the reason is because socialism claims to offer the solution to human suffering. And when you're told that, hey, people are starving, the solution is to give them free food. People are suffering, the solution is to kill or eliminate the people causing the suffering. There are people who view this as being like the compassionate thing to do, but what they don't really understand is that it does not work. You don't create wealth by targeting the wealthy. You create wealth by creating incentives or helping the poor build themselves up. You don't create wealth by tearing things down. You create wealth by building things. And so socialism is just based on redistribution of what is already there. Socialism really can't create wealth unless it feeds on the wealthy. But as soon as you feed on the wealthy, you remove the incentive, people stop bothering to do it, and it flattens society. Socialism is for the downward trend. And so, you could argue that there are problems within capitalism. A lot of people, including myself, would argue the problems that people point to in capitalism are usually from state interventionist policies. The reason, for example, why housing costs are so high, mostly because of red tape on new construction. If you want to fix the housing problem where people can't afford rent, remove these state interventionist policies which stem from socialism that prevent us from building new homes or allow monopolies to form. If you let the free market function, it means that when there's demand, you create supply, not that you restrict supply, increase demand, and then strangle society through it. So socialism always does not work because it can only work as long as you can feed on the capitalist.
Okay, just one last question, Josh. Do you think there will be a big impact, or maybe you don't think there will be a big impact, if Mamdani, in fact, wins this race and becomes the next mayor for New York City?
There will be a big impact if Mamdani wins. I don't think the impact will be that heavy in New York. And it will be. I mean, it will be to an extent. It's not going to be a whole lot worse than New York was, I think, under COVID, to be honest. Because he's going to be stopped from doing a lot of things because of the risk of losing government funding from the federal level. Trump is probably going to put his foot on the brakes and say, hey, you can't do that. It's probably not going to be a whole lot worse than California, to be honest, where they have a lot of these policies he's talking about already in place. And the other reality, too, is this, the city council in New York is already very far left. They already practice a lot of these policies. But the bigger impact is actually going to be more for what it means on the midterms and the future of the Democratic Party. Because right now, what do you have? You have really the Democratic Party looking for its new leadership, and you have them looking at AOC and Bernie Sanders, both of whom have been more on the Democratic Socialists of America side. This is really a battle, I think, for the future of the Democratic Party and the types of candidates who they choose as their front runners, which is why Cuomo is pushing back against Mamdani, which is why Nancy Pelosi is pushing back against Mamdani. The Democrats, I think, understand that, yeah, you might have a socialist win in a local election, but it's not going to work for the big ones. And the Democrats, if they go too far to the extreme, which is what the risk is here, they're going to lose the middle.